I had been driving for hours, trying to get across the country to see my son. He was with my ex, and I had been out of state, caring for a sick family member. It was the middle of the night, somewhere in New Mexico, when I noticed the flashing lights of a police car in my rearview mirror. I wasn't speeding, and there hadn't been any other cars around for a while, so I couldn't figure out why I was being pulled over. I was already exhausted, and this felt like the last thing I needed. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the highway. It was strange that the officer came up to my driver's side window. Usually they approach the passenger side, especially on a highway, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. He asked for my license and registration, so I handed them over. For a moment he just stood there staring at me. It felt longer than usual, like he was sizing me up. Then, without even going back to his car to run my information, he told me to step out of the vehicle. That's when I started to worry. I'd gotten tickets before, but being asked to step out of the car wasn't something I'd experienced. Still, I complied. He asked me if I'd been drinking. I told him I hadn't, and then asked why he pulled me over. He claimed I'd been driving erratically, which wasn't true at all. Then things took a turn. He asked me if I was a terrorist. That threw me off completely. I didn't know how to respond at first. I was just a 24-year-old woman driving across the country, so the question didn't make any sense. He didn't stop there. He decided to give me a sobriety test, making me walk a straight line on the side of the road. I passed without a problem. Then he said he needed to search my car for drugs. I knew I had rights and could refuse, but it was so late, and I was so tired that I just agreed to avoid dragging things out. He started searching my car, and when he got to my small suitcase, he opened it up. Inside was my work gear, something I used for my job as a dancer. When he saw it, his demeanor changed. He asked about it, and I told him I worked as a stripper. That set him off. He started yelling at me, calling me names. I could feel the situation becoming more dangerous. I looked around. We were alone, with only the occasional car passing by in the distance. It was the middle of the night, and there were trees lining the road. He had a gun, and I didn't have anything to defend myself with. Then he told me to walk into the trees. I froze. This wasn't normal. I refused, standing my ground. I demanded that he call for backup and get a female officer there. I wasn't going to comply with anything else he asked. I started waving at passing cars, hoping to catch someone's attention. His attitude shifted when he saw I wasn't going to go along with whatever plan he had. He wrote me a ticket, claiming I was speeding, and let me go. I never paid that ticket, and I never heard anything about it afterward. This happened 20 years ago, and at the time I was too shaken to think about it for long. But now, looking back, I'm not even sure if he was a real cop. A few years ago, I joined a dating site and matched with a police officer. His profile picture caught my eye because of his dog, a canine police dog, and I thought this might be my chance to finally pet one. But things changed quickly. As soon as we started chatting, he began venting about his recent divorce. I didn't remember all the details, but it became clear that he was the one causing problems in that relationship. His attitude rubbed me the wrong way, and I became even more uncomfortable when he made comments about my appearance, fixating on my tattoos, hair, and body in a way that felt really off. I told him straight up that I wasn't interested. Something about him just set off alarm bells. He begged for another chance, but I wasn't having it. I blocked his number and moved on. A few days later, close to midnight, there was a knock at my door. The sound jolted me. I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing outside holding a bag of food. It was an Uber Eats delivery driver. I hadn't ordered anything, so I told him that through the door, but he insisted someone else had ordered it for me and even knew my name. When I asked who placed the order, he gave me a name that didn't ring any bells. I was suspicious at this point. I didn't want the food and just gave him directions to the dumpster to get rid of it. After he left, I tried to piece things together. I went through my old dating app matches and realized that the name he gave me was the cops. I unblocked his messages and saw a flood of texts from him, the last one saying he hoped I liked my dinner. It was unsettling. I decided to leave the number unblocked so I could keep an eye on what he was doing, just in case. A few weeks later, while I was at work, I'm a hairstylist, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Assuming it was a new client, I answered. The person on the other end said they were at a Starbucks across the street and asked for my drink order. I didn't recognize the voice, so I checked my appointment book but found nothing. Then I asked who it was. When I heard his name, everything clicked again. My stomach dropped. He had figured out where I worked. I asked him how he knew where I lived and worked, and he casually explained that he had done a reverse image search on my dating profile photos, found my social media, tracked down my Yelp page for the salon, and then used that to find my address. I didn't know what to say at first, but I told him I'd report him to his station for stalking, and that if he ever came near me, I would treat it as a threat. After hanging up, I called the police station he worked at, it was a small town, and tried to file a complaint. The woman I spoke to didn't seem too concerned. She even apologized for him, saying he was going through a tough time. It felt like they were treating him as the victim. After that, he mostly left me alone, but the fear lingered. It was my first time living alone, and knowing he had all that information about me was unsettling. I had a semi-popular Instagram meme page with a few thousand followers, and I started sifting through them, trying to spot him. Sure enough, I found 5 of his accounts following me. I blocked them all and tried to move on. Years later, I'd mostly forgotten about it. But one day, while scrolling through Instagram, I saw a familiar profile picture in the comments under one of my posts. It was him. I must have missed one of his accounts. I'd posted a photo from a recent fishing trip where I'd caught 2 big tunas, and there it was. A comment saying he wished he was one of those fish, just to know what it'd be like to be held by me. Earlier this year, something happened that shook me to my core as a father. I'm a 30-year-old man, married with a young daughter, living in a small town in rural Northern California. This place sits right in the middle of where the gold rush happened, and while I've always found the area beautiful, there's a strange vibe that hangs over it. Maybe it's because of the history, people killing for wealth, the land being taken, but there's always been an odd mix of reclusive people around here. This story isn't about that, though. This was something far more terrifying. I had a random day off, and my wife and I decided to take a drive to a semi-local gun show. I occasionally get tables at these shows, and I've got friends who attend regularly, so I thought it'd be a good chance to check things out. I'm always on the lookout for obscure parts for old military weapons, and we had some family in the area, so it seemed like a nice little trip. It was a cold, gloomy day, fitting for the kind of winter we had. We drove about an hour, got to the show, and walked right in. The promoters knew us, so we didn't have to wait around. I was carrying my daughter with me as we walked through the aisles, passing by tables, checking out the items. She was still very small at the time, only a few months old, and cute in that way that makes people stop and gush. A few people would smile and make comments, the usual stuff. Sometimes we'd even draw a little crowd of older ladies and grandpa types admiring her. I was way too young to be at an event like this, but I brushed it off. She wouldn't remember any of it anyway. Most of the interactions were harmless and lighthearted, but there was one guy who stood out. He seemed overly excited, more than you'd expect. He told me he used to work as an EMT and in a NICU for years, so I figured that explained his enthusiasm around babies. It didn't seem too strange at the time. As the afternoon went on, I noticed the same man crossing my path a few more times. He wasn't walking with the crowd. He seemed to be moving against it, like he was deliberately passing by me. Each time he'd comment again on how beautiful my daughter was. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much more about it. Eventually, my wife needed to breastfeed, so we headed out to the car. We had some blinds in the back seat for privacy, and I turned on the heater, locked the doors, and left her there while I went back inside to help a friend sell during a busier time. It couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes later when my phone rang. It was my wife, and she sounded frantic. At that moment, I had just noticed some law enforcement officers getting up and heading outside. I managed to calm my wife down enough to understand what had happened. While she was feeding our daughter in the car, she got this sudden feeling, like that instinctual sense when something's wrong. She looked up and saw a shadow standing right outside her door, blocking it from opening. The person was holding something small, a metal tube, maybe a flashlight. Just then, a sheriff's car pulled up. The officer had seen us go to the car earlier and must have noticed something was off. He asked the man what he was doing. The guy tried to claim he was just talking to my wife, but she barely rolled down the window to tell the officer that wasn't true. She didn't know him and didn't want anything to do with him. The officer asked the man for his name. As soon as he turned to run it, the guy started to slip away, trying to get out of sight. Something about it didn't sit right. More officers came over and they detained him. It turned out the name he gave was fake. Within a minute of calling in his real name, they had him arrested. He had felony warrants for kidnapping. He was waiting for the cars parked nearby to leave, and when they did, he planned to take my wife and daughter. If that cop hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened. I'm just thankful that officer showed up when he did. This happened when I was about 13 or 14. I lived in a small town with lots of walking and biking trails. There was a large forested area about a 10-minute walk from my house, so I spent a lot of time outdoors. One of my best friends, who lived in the neighborhood across from mine, often joined me on these outdoor adventures. I'd usually head over to his house, knock on his door, and see if he wanted to ride bikes around town with me. On this particular day, he agreed to come along and we biked down to the local lake. The lake was a popular spot, especially during the summer. It was rarely empty. There was a trail next to the library that led straight to the lake, and we decided to hang out near the entrance of that trail. Right by the entrance was a tunnel that ran under the road above. The tunnel was a good place to cool off, with plenty of shade, and the acoustics were great for listening to music. We leaned our bikes against the tunnel wall and played some music from our iPods. The tunnel was about 20 feet long, with a paved path on one side that led back up to the street. The trail itself was gravel, lined with trees on both sides. The only easy way to leave with a bike was by using the trail's designated entrances and exits. We hung out on the far end of the tunnel, away from the trail entrance, to avoid disturbing families passing by. As we stood there, I saw a man appear at the far end of the tunnel near the trail entrance. He walked toward us, and once he was about 15 feet away, he called out, claiming to be a police officer from our city. But it was obvious that he wasn't. He wore cargo shorts, a green tank top, sandals, and a large military-style backpack. His skin looked greasy, his hair was a mess, and everything about him felt off. I knew right away that something bad was about to happen. My friend was still beside me, so I quickly shouted for him to run. He got on his bike and took off, heading straight for the trail entrance. The man stood between us and the entrance, so the only way out was past him, or down the opposite end of the trail, deeper into the woods. My friend decided to take the risk and ride toward the main entrance, trying to speed past the man. As he passed, the man reached out and grabbed his arm. For a second it looked like my friend was stuck, but the man's grip slipped, and he focused back on me. My friend didn't wait around. He took off, disappearing down the trail. I knew I wouldn't be able to get past him as easily as my friend had. There wasn't time to think, so I looked around for another way out. That's when I spotted a narrow dirt path on the same side of the tunnel where we had been. I jumped on my bike and tried to ride up the dirt trail. Behind me, I heard the man shout something about not running from the police, but I didn't listen. The trail quickly became too small for my bike, so I dropped it and kept running, hoping the path would lead back up to the street. The man chased me for a short while, but eventually he gave up. I kept running until I made it to the library, where I came out near the top of the tunnel. From there, I could see down to the trail. I looked around to see where the man had gone, but all I saw was him riding off on my bike. I walked home and called the police. When they arrived, they asked me to look at a lineup of photos. I recognized him immediately. He and his twin brother were known in the area. They were homeless and addicted to meth, which explained his appearance and behavior. Apparently, they had been stealing bikes for a while, but never so boldly. I was just relieved it hadn't gone worse. With someone like him, there was always the chance that things could have escalated into something much more dangerous. To the fake cop who stole my bike, let's not meet again. I live in a middle-class suburban town on the East Coast, where the community is fiercely anti-drug. The police presence here is overwhelming, especially with a fleet of unmarked vehicles, which is unusual for a town with relatively low crime rates. The police force seems fixated on catching the occasional pot-smoking teenager, and the variety of unmarked cars is absurd. They range from brand-new Chevy sedans and hatchbacks to flashy Cadillac SUVs, Dodge Chargers, classic Ford Grand Victorias, and even fake taxis. It feels like there's a hidden police vehicle around every corner. Because of the sheer number of unmarked cars, many get decommissioned and sold as used vehicles. One of my friends owns a decommissioned Ford Grand Victoria that still looks like it belongs to the force. Last week I found myself driving home from a date around midnight in an area I didn't know very well. I was sticking to the speed limit when I noticed an unmarked police car tailgating me. The road was mostly deserted, and he followed closely for about 5 miles before finally flipping on his lights. My heart raced. I had never been pulled over before, and I was past curfew, which added to my unease. Plus, I had a small stash of illegal herbs hidden under my spare tire in the trunk. I was well aware of my town's strict police enforcement and was feeling anxious. I pulled off the road into an abandoned gas station. As I prepared my documents, I noticed the officer approaching my window. He wore a police uniform and looked surprisingly young and handsome, with longer hair than most officers. He leaned into my car, which made me uncomfortable, and asked where I was headed and why I thought I was pulled over. I simply shook my head, indicating I had no idea. He smirked, suggesting he did know, and returned to his car with my license and registration. As I watched him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. His unmarked car had a civilian license plate and no police badge. I also noticed that his pants were awkwardly short, exposing several inches of his ankles. Something felt very wrong. I decided to stay in my car, my instincts screaming at me. When he returned, he instructed me to pull around to the back of the gas station. I turned on my engine, but my mind was racing with alarm bells. It made no sense to go behind the building. It felt like an attempt to isolate me. As he walked back to his car, I quickly rolled up my window and dialed 911. I told the operator about the suspicious stop and read her the license plate number. Her response sent a chill down my spine. She insisted that the car couldn't possibly belong to the police and urged me to leave the area immediately and drive to a public place. I reluctantly followed the officer's directions, pulling around behind the building. He followed closely, and when I tried to escape onto the main road, he flipped on his lights and pursued me. Still on the line with 911, I felt a sense of panic grow. The operator wasn't offering any help, and I was in a car chase with a vehicle that looked like a police car. My heart raced as I drove my 1994 Nissan, which could barely accelerate. I flew down a dark road I didn't know, pushing my speed to 75 miles an hour, faster than I had ever driven. My car started shaking violently, and the engine made a horrible clicking noise, but I couldn't afford to stop. The unmarked car stayed right behind me, lights flashing but no sirens. I flew through a red light, praying that I would somehow find safety. As I turned onto a busier road in my town, I gripped the wheel tightly. I knew this area well, and I hoped to attract the attention of a real police officer. I thought about the places where officers often hid, waiting to catch speeders. Finally, I spotted an abandoned diner with an empty parking lot. Without hesitation, I whipped into it, thinking I might find a hiding police car. I stopped and scanned the area, my heart sinking when I saw no one around. The emptiness of the diner parking lot was deafening, and my car's engine groaned in protest. Panic flooded over me. I had expected to find safety but was instead alone, trapped in that parking lot. The only sound was the chaotic clatter from my engine, and I feared it wouldn't start again. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, frozen in place. The moment I heard a car door slam, I braced myself for the worst. I turned to look in the mirror, expecting to see the officer with his awkwardly short pants, but instead, I saw 3 marked police cars pull in, with several officers stepping out, their hands hovering near their weapons. Concern was etched on their faces. They approached me and quickly assessed the situation. I was relieved to be taken to the station, where I recounted the entire event. The officers assured me that the fake police car had likely abandoned the chase when I turned into the diner parking lot, probably fearing there was a real police presence nearby. They praised me for my quick thinking in calling 911 and warned me about a string of violent rapes in a neighboring state involving a suspect who had used similar tactics. As far as I know, they haven't caught him yet.